Good morning. My research very much focuses on what I call British jihadism, so involvement of a small but not insignificant number of British Sunni Muslims in conflict, both in this country and in a whole series of foreign theatres, and certainly South Asia has been particularly important in that. Now, quality perhaps isn't totally brilliant here, but this is a picture of a banned terrorist group in the UK, Al Mahroon, and you'll recognise the very left there, Anjem Choudary, been a very prominent figure in the UK in recent years, currently in prison for advocating support for Islamic State. Suleiman Keela, I think, similarly arrested. Trevor Brooks, also known as Abu Izzadeen, who trained in Kashmir in the early 2000s at military camps there. And if I dance right across over here, Kiran Butt, who carried out the London Bridge terrorist attack last year. You remember when a van crashed into a series of people and there was a follow-up set of stabbings. Now, at this meeting, they established a group called Sharia for Pakistan, which was to lobby for harsher Sharia laws in Pakistan. And as with a lot of Al Mahroon initiatives, didn't really come to very much. But the appetite really is what I want to draw people's attention to, the aims, the objectives. Now, in any lecture, any talk, any discussion about terrorism, one of the challenges is where do you start? And you can probably tell quite a bit about somebody's research and their perspective by their starting point. I always get a bit frustrated with colleagues who start discussions about terrorism with 9/11, as if the world began that day, and it didn't. You know, 9/11 was the culmination of a whole series of events which we've been moving towards for some time. So I'm going to start back in 1981, and Mrs. Thatcher, our then Prime Minister, her visit to Pakistan. You can see her here with General Zia, who at that time was Pakistan's military dictator. And he'd taken Pakistan through a period of very intense Islamification, really throughout much of the 70s. He'd had executed the previous leader, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And the British, really, by the Thatcher visit, were endorsing him, endorsing his leadership, endorsing his policies. And General Zia, certainly a man who knew how to treat a lady, he took Mrs. Thatcher to Peshawar, to a refugee camp, where Afghans who had fled from the fighting in the conflict there following the Soviet invasion were to be found. And again, the British endorsed very much the struggle against the Afghan communist government, but also the struggle against the Soviet Union, who were backing that government. So the Islamists were our friends then. They were the good guys. And if you read Mark Curtis's very good book, Secret Affairs, on Britain's long-standing relationships with Islamist actors in a whole series of theatres, historically, the British government perspective has been very much that we're wary of nationalists, we're wary of socialists or communists. We could do business with Zia, we could do business with the Afghan Mujahideen. Now, some of my teaching on campus here at Leicester, we've looked at Mrs. Thatcher's relationship with General Pinochet, which is sometimes regarded as being particularly damaging, particularly shameful episode in British foreign policy. As Curtis argues, and I would myself, that probably had very little long-term effect. Chile's now a liberal democracy. Pakistan and its region, though, have continued with a whole series of conflicts. That relationship didn't bring stability. Now, by the early 1990s, the Soviets had left Afghanistan, and indeed the Soviet Union's collapsed. I noticed on Twitter recently, General Zia's son advocating really for his father, arguing this was great success because lots of new Muslim nations are created. You know, the world's seen through this sort of clash of civilizations thesis, the sort of Huntington approach. And really in the 1990s we see a small number of British Muslims in a way looking at the world through a similar lens. We begin to see young Britons from cities like this, like Leicester, picking up the gun, going to fight in conflicts. And we know from some of the memoirs to emerge, for example, from the Bosnian Civil War, that people having been there, the next step for some is to go to Kashmir. But it's a two-way journey. There's a process of cross-fertilisation. It's not just about young Britons who are looking for something, who are travelling to the Indian subcontinent. There's also important clerics, leaders of terrorist groups, coming to the UK. So 1993, see Masood Azhar, the movement for the victorious armed group, and he's on a speaking tour, British mosques. Innes Bowen, the BBC's religious correspondent, is particularly good at researching this period. What's also beginning to happen, though, is there's evidence emerging that these relationships are problematic. So Omar Saeed Sheikh, London School of Economics graduate, travels to Bosnia, is ill, can't take part in fighting, but he meets people who say, you should be in Kashmir, mate. Come to Kashmir. 1994, Masood Azhar is is in custody in India. Omar Saeed Sheikh leads a series of kidnappings of British tourists, befriends people, fellow Brits, and he's trying to get the leader released. 1995, we see two leading figures in the Lashkar-e-Taiba armed group, Hafiz Saeed, who's continuously in the news at the moment in Pakistan, and Abu Abdulaziz, speaking at this university. And their argument to students here is British Muslims can find salvation. You can find salvation by fighting in Bosnia. You can find salvation by fighting in Kashmir. These were the days before Prevent. Okay? Anybody could turn up and say anything on a university campus. But there's some serious, there's a troublesome legacy, if you like, raised by this. And Lashkar-e-Taiba, for example, go on to be responsible for the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attack, where over 160 people are killed. These are groups who are willing to kill large numbers of people. And we've got an enormous debate about Prevent that may be slightly off topic. I know how controversial it is among student unions and on campus. The only comment I would make is that certainly in the past, an open door policy did also bring problems. I'm not saying that Prevent hasn't brought problems. So, this period of cross-fertilisation between Britain and South Asia really continues through the 1990s. Reading a piece by one of the people involved in the Cage NGO in the UK, which supports people arrested in the war on terror, and he talks about how the Taliban regime in Afghanistan was viewed by some Britons as the purest, the closest approximation to the life of the Prophet that had ever been created by Sunni Muslims. So if you believe that, what do? You go to Afghanistan, because here is actually existing Sharia. And we start to see young Britons going out there. Taking things back domestically and looking at some of the more mainstream trends, 1997 was a really important year in our politics. Election of the new Labour government and 18 years of Conservative rule. But also the formation, at the suggestion of the Conservative politician Michael Howard, of the Muslim Council of Britain, which seeks to be an umbrella organisation bringing together British Muslims. And right from the start, the MCB is greatly influenced by Pakistan's main clerical party, the Jamaat Islami. Initially, it has absolutely sound relations with New Labour. At some stage I want to write something about how, I think both sides really saw something in the other that probably wasn't there. And, sort of like a very good first date, and then things go downhill a little bit from there. But you see throughout the 1990s, the late 1990s, Muslim Council of Britain supporting verbally that armed struggle in Kashmir and lobbying very hard against proposed counter-terrorism policies. This is an era where there's a small group of Saudi Arabian exiles in London who are promoting the work of Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden's, if journalists wanted to go and interview bin Laden in this period, you came to London and the arrangements were made via his associates. The Muslim Council of Britain view of this is, this is just silly. You can't declare jihad by fax. These guys are supposedly working on fax machines, causing all these problems. Muslims have never heard of Al-Qaeda. And that really was the MCB line right up until 9/11. They were distinctly unsuccessful in their lobbying against the Terrorism Act 2000, which comes into play in March 2001 and now bans these Kashmiri-related organisations who had previously been able to recruit quite openly in the UK. Okay, so the LET, on the Leicester University campus, no more. Where the MCB was much more successful was really in seeking to influence how the authorities frame discussion of terrorist attacks, how we, if you like, refer to armed groups. And I can remember going to a Prevent meeting in Birmingham in 2010, and not one person in 6 or 7 hours said Islamist or jihadist. I remember an earlier academic conference, police officer berating people for doing so. They don't get those political positions out of thin air, they get them because that's what the MCB have lobbied so hard for. And the authorities want to work with these representative organisations. They believe it's in the common good. Now, what was happening before LET was prescribed in the UK? Anybody come here by train today? Okay, well, you'd have used Network Rail. Network Rail's predecessor organisation was Railtrack, and one of their senior managers was a guy called Mohammed Suhail, who, in his lunch hour, would be on his email arranging trips for people to go to, as you can see here, Azad Kashmir, to train with LET. And as a sort of one-stop shop, if you wanted to go to Afghanistan as well, you could do it through him. So it was comparatively easy to do if you knew the right people to ask. This really comes to a crashing end with 9/11. After 9/11, obviously, the US pretty quickly invades Afghanistan, and we're beginning to see Britons being arrested by the Northern Alliance, who were fighting the Taliban. We're beginning to see Britons being arrested in the Af-Pak border areas. Lots of people who ended up in Guantanamo Bay were arrested in that way. And I think within British Muslim communities, there had already been some disquiet about things. There was a group of guys from Burnley in Lancashire who were all killed fighting for the Taliban against the Northern Alliance in 1998, and Abu Hamza was basically banned from mosques in the town as a result. So the early hints were there. Now, I think it's interesting the extent to which this crossover, or the importance of the South Asian connection, is usually played down in histories of British terrorism. Focus is much more on some of the Arab exiles who came to London late 80s, early 90s, Abu Hamza, Abu Qatada, Omar Bakri Mohammed, who formed the Al-Maharoon group. But we're beginning to see now an argument that actually Something like the Syrian jihad, its early predecessor, earlier example, is Kashmir. And in his poem really picks out the importance of these Pakistani clerics coming to the UK in this period. Okay, this is Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of Al-Qaeda. After the death of bin Laden, we get this big statement and you have a poem. And he mentions in this poem all sorts of the areas where Al-Qaeda have picked up the gun. And where bin Laden and his comrades were in struggle. And the very first conflict mentioned is Kashmir. But what I draw your attention to, I mentioned Huntington earlier in the Clash of Civilizations thesis, this isn't a conflict between East and West, this isn't a conflict between Muslim and Christian, this is a conflict within Kashmir, between, if you like, India and Pakistan. Or involving the peoples of Kashmir. Okay, I'm going to finish by just giving you a few sort of pen pictures, some of the events, some of the players. This is Omar Saeed Sheikh pictured. But we have probably the first British suicide bomber, 1996 in Afghanistan, and an attack in Indian-controlled Kashmir in 2000, both involving young Britons from Birmingham, first joining the Taliban, the second the Army of Mohammed group. And probably the most dramatic events in this period, Omar Saeed Sheikh and Masood Azhar, the cleric, both in custody in India after events in the early 1990s. Pakistani intelligence wants them out. And obviously their comrades want them out. So an Indian Airlines flight is hijacked and probably taken to the one place in the world the Indian Special Forces couldn't get to it. Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. And after about a week of negotiation, the Indian authorities roll over. And Azhar and Omar Saeed Sheikh were released. I'm not sure if there's ever been as dramatic sort of way of getting out of custody involving a British citizen than that. We don't hear too much of Omar Saeed Sheikh until the period after 9/11, where the American journalist Daniel Pearl is investigating alleged connections between Pakistan and 9/11. And he starts receiving emails in perfect English from somebody with information for him. And he agrees to meet that individual. Fatal mistake. That's who he's going to meet. He's kidnapped and he's then executed in probably the first of these sort of televised executions that we've seen so much of in Syria. And Omar Saeed Sheikh, I think, is now one of, there's about 13 or 14 Britons on death row in Pakistan. Nearly all having allegedly killed people in family disputes, land disputes, that type of thing. He's the only one on death row for a terrorism offence. I'm going to come on also to Rashid Rauf, just to bring things towards the end. You'll see pictured here, because he's really a central figure in certainly the failed terrorist attacks planned in Britain in 2003 and also in 7/7. He marries into the Army of Mohammed group, marries the daughter of one of its leaders, had to flee Birmingham after the police Westminster Police, I think it's still on the Interpol website, wants him for an alleged murder in Birmingham of his uncle, but he becomes involved in armed struggle in Pakistan, and we know that in the days running up to the 7/7 bombings, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, the leader of the group, was constantly receiving phone calls from Rawalpindi. Almost certainly from Rauf. Rauf's big plan was the liquid bomb plot of 2006, which was bring down airliners between the UK and North America, discovered by the police, failed. And these various plots, all linked to South Asia, lead to British Prime Minister Gordon Brown visiting Pakistan in 2008 and arguing, some might say rather rudely in front of his host, the Pakistan Prime Minister, that 3/4 of terrorist plots in Britain originate in Pakistan. This has all begun to fade, or has all faded in recent years, in large part because of the Syrian conflict. However, as you can see set out here, we do have various examples in recent years. People, latest 2012, 2014, fighting in fighting in Pakistan, and then travelling on from there to Syria. And we also have particularly difficult likelihood that in Afghanistan, Britain at one point was fighting Britain. The British Army finding evidence of British fighters in the Taliban ranks. Okay, so in my book, using open source material, I tried to draw together some of the numbers killed, as well as some of the pen portraits. And certainly been able to name 10 Britons killed fighting in Afghanistan, 1996 to 2011. Similar number in Pakistan and Kashmir. Majority of those killed in drone strikes. Okay, so again, controversial. No trial here. Simply intelligence is gathered and persons involved are hit with drones. Seen as a little bit in Somalia as well, but mostly US drone strikes in the Indo-Pak border areas in particular. One of those killed a Palestinian citizen who'd lived in London for a long time, Mahmoud Abu Ridi. You can see his children here involved in protests. He was held in Britain under a control order which restricted his movements. He eventually reached an agreement with the British authorities to come off the control order and leave the country. He didn't go with his family to Jordan, where his wife, I think now resides, went to Pakistan, rejoined Al-Qaeda, killed in a drone strike in 2011. I think the most recent British death, one of the people who formed the Sharia for Pakistan group, Pakistani doctor living in London, Dr. Mirza Ali, and he was killed fighting with the Taliban in 2015. So, in any history of domestic terrorism, the connections between Britain and South Asia, this sort of cross-flow interaction needs to be set out. There's a whole series of other things I could have looked at in terms of sectarianism in Pakistan and how anti-Shia movements, anti-Ahmadi movements have developed in the UK. So I didn't really have time to go into. But I do want to put on the table that if Islamic State and the various Al-Qaeda related groups are defeated in Syria and Iraq, where is their next destination? Certainly the possibility that significant numbers will be heading to Pakistan, perhaps to Afghanistan, perhaps to Kashmir. The UK government's cancelled a large number of dual citizenships of British Pakistani citizens, so some of those guys certainly can't come back to Britain. They presumably go back to Pakistan. Kashmir question, I think, has some resonance on the fringes of British politics, but it lacks the focus of other struggles. You know, people in the Labour Party, they're interested in the Palestinian question, not interested in Kashmir, with a few local exceptions. So this is an unresolved issue, perhaps doesn't get the attention, the focus that it could. So my contact details are on there if anybody wants my slides. Be here all day to discuss things with you, and do support the work of the think tank. Thank you.